only case I can think of offhand of somebody who really expressed what seemed like a sincere apology for his support for war. Other than that, there's no accountability. It's very easy from your office at Harvard or the National Security Council in the case of Samantha Power. By the way, she did not support the Iraq War, but she clearly was one of the architects, certainly, of the war in Libya. What will she say if this war goes badly and makes the situation worse? Maybe "I'm sorry" isn't enough. Anyway, this has to be taken seriously, I think, the issue of accountability. By the way, you could say, and this is a fair point, what if you are like me and you argue against intervention in Libya, and because of your arguments, the intervention doesn't occur, and there's a major massacre as a result? There's accountability there too, isn't there? And that's a fair point. I would say this, however. In all cases, those who argue for military action in war, the onus should be on them, in my view, to make the stronger case. A more reasonable default case is no war, no intervention. That's my opinion, is that the onus should always be on those who advocate for military force over those who do not advocate for military force. One more point is, it must be said, in reading the arguments for intervention, not only in Libya but elsewhere, I often get a sense of, I must say this, a certain sense of excitement that people feel about the idea of military force and intervention. There's something very exciting about the idea of a moral crusade with bombs. One gets a certain sense of being a more moral person by writing a letter to one's congressman, let us say, and argue for bombing of Gaddafi's forces. But again, one gets a sense of maybe excitement, and a sense of moral uplift isn't enough. And again, there's the question of, what if you do all this and you feel you're a more moral person and it goes badly and people suffer as a result? What do you say then? Well, in any case, I think that there's a real possibility of this. We don't really know what the outcome of the Libya intervention will be in the long term. I'm reluctant to make too many predictions. But before I do that, I'd like to go into a little bit of history on the precursor to the intervention, which I think is relevant. Let me say at the outset, I cannot claim to be a Libya specialist, although I've read a moderate amount on the history of Libya. I'm more of a specialist on humanitarian intervention. But I do want to briefly go over the, this is an extraordinarily outsized map here. Let me see if I can downsize it a bit. All right, well, it's small, but that'll do, I suppose. There you have Libya, ladies and gentlemen. Libya, to a large extent, is an artificial creation of colonialism, like so many states. You know, the colonial rule, to some extent, goes back to the, it didn't exist as a country, basically, until colonialism created it as a country, as a state. It is, in that sense, a certain sense of the term, an artificial state, one with, at the very least, a weak sense of national identification, or at least an incomplete sense of national identification. Reminds me a little bit of many states in Africa. I started out as an Africa specialist, for what that's worth. And you know, the idea basically as nation states as a creation of colonialism is a very familiar one. The colonialism began in the 1500s in Libya's case with the Ottomans, later taken over by Italy in 1912. And the country was, for most of the colonial period, governed basically as three separate provinces. The provinces were in the east, centering around Benghazi, you had Cyrenaica. In the west, comprising Tripoli, you had Tripolitania. And the southwest, you had Fezzan. And basically, under Ottoman rule into Italian rule, the colony was governed not as a singular colony, but as those three separate provinces. You had, under Italian rule, the unification of the colony into one colony only in 1934. This is really the first time you had anything in any meaningful sense of Libya as a centralized entity, and then only as a colony. By all indications, the sense of national unity from 34 on was somewhat limited, based on the fact that you had, well, back then you had different ethnic groups, not really different ethnic groups, I would say more different clans, some of which had a formal tribal structure, that persists to this day, at least a sense of identification with clan based on the colonial and pre-colonial period. And it depends how you want to define clan, but by most estimates, there are over 100 organized clans today in Libya coming out of this former colonial entity. The country has a kind of superficial unity based upon Arabic language, which is predominant, although there's significant Berber and also the Tuareg language Tamarshek in the south. Predominantly, Arabic is the overwhelmingly dominant language, and of course Islam. Though there had been a Christian and Jewish community earlier on that's gone basically, and it's almost 100% Islamic. You know, one would imagine that would give it a certain sense of unity, but the clan identification remains very strong. And indeed, there's still a regional difference between the colonial division, especially between Benghazi and Tripoli, based upon separate colonial administrations. After World War II, the British conquered Italian Libya in the north and the French in Fezzan. And the country was given formal independence in 1951 under King Idris. The country was one of the most underdeveloped in the Middle East, indeed one of the more underdeveloped in the continent of Africa. One of its main sources of income was, in addition to foreign aid, sales of scrap metal from tanks left over from the great battles of World War II. The discovery of oil in 1959 transformed the country, giving it a major source of development. King Idris was generally regarded as an ineffectual leader who was overly compliant with the wishes of Western oil companies. Also at the United States and its partner Great Britain, the US had a large air base, Wheeless Air Force Base in Libya, formerly a British base. And you know, Idris was seen by younger Libyans as something of as a weak leader, maybe in some cases even a sellout, perhaps, to the West. Libya has a long tradition of anti-colonialism going back to the Italians, with a large-scale insurgency in the 20s and 30s, killing tens of thousands of people, and a legacy of bitterness at the sense of being victimized by the West. In 1969, a group of young officers, led by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, then in his 20s, overthrew Idris. A very widely popular overthrow by almost all indications, at least initially. Modern-day Libya really was the creation of Gaddafi. Gaddafi nationalized, at least in part, the oil industry of Libya, played a major role in making OPEC a force in the world and challenging the West by a large series of oil price increases in the early and mid-70s. You know, played a role as well, try making a bout, anyway, for leadership in the Arab world after the death of Nasser, as sort of the replacement of Nasser as standing for Arab honor against Western and Israeli imperialism. You know, overall, it must be said that, on balance, in retrospect, the image of Gaddafi as a tyrant is largely accurate. On the other hand, it must be said he had his degree of accomplishments. First in foreign policy, playing a leadership role in OPEC, however damaging that was to the West and many third world countries, it did indeed give a certain power to oil exporters, including in the Arab world, that they never had before. And domestically, oil was used for a lot of purposes in Libya, but one of them was indeed to increase the living standard of Libya. Libya became one of the more developed countries on the African continent. If you look at all the indices of development, it ranks not quite at the top of the African continent, but close to the top. And one has to credit Libya's leader Gaddafi with having done that. Libya's leader also had a dark side, as we all know, developing a security force and a level of repression that was one of the worst in the Arab world, very much more reminiscent of such countries as East Germany. It was, to a large extent, a one-man operation, led by Gaddafi himself and later on his family of sons and one daughter. He had a history of supporting terrorism, including blowing up French and American airliners in the 1980s, killing hundreds. And he also was used much of his oil money for a massive arms buying spree, buying huge quantities of advanced fighter planes, tanks, and the like from Western states. mainly from the Soviet Union, but also very substantially from France as well.